Welcome to the Research Data Alliance Data Streams podcast series, a place where researchers, scientists, and data professionals share their experience of working together in the global Research Data Alliance community to address and solve the challenges of sharing and managing research data. My name is Stephanie Hagstrom, and I am the Director of Community Development at the RDA US and the host of this podcast series. Today we will hear about the experiences, challenges, lessons learned, and successes of one of the oldest RDA groups, the Data Citation Working Group. I am joined by the two chairs of this group, Mark Parsons, a research scientist at the University of Alabama, who was also the former Secretary General of the RDA, and Andreas Rauber, head of the Information and Software Engineering Group at the Vienna University of Technology. Thank you both for joining us today. Mark, let's get started with you, telling us a bit about your history with the RDA and how this group began.
Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here. So, RDA started back in February 2013 with its initial meeting, what we call plenary meetings. And we have plenary meetings every 6 months. And that's because they're meant to be really working meetings. They have some aspects of a conference, there's usually a keynote speaker or something, but most of the time is devoted to actually doing the work. I was the first Secretary General of RDA. I didn't actually start as Secretary General until about a year later, but have been involved since the beginning. It's also probably helpful to take note of the mission of RDA, which is to build the social and technical bridges that enable the open sharing and reuse of data. And that's a very deliberate metaphor, the bridges, because it's really about building connections between technologies, connections between different data sources, connections between different cultures or disciplines. It's the connections that really build an infrastructure. And the way that RDA gets its work done is through working groups and interest groups. Interest groups are longer standing bodies. And one of the things that they often do is generate working groups. And working groups are meant to be very short term. They're meant to get their work done in about 18 months or about 3 plenaries. And they're meant to deliver some sort of recommendation, an output that can be implemented by an organization that does a small piece of improving data sharing. And so I believe one of the very first working groups, and I want to ask you about this in a minute, Andy, was the Data Citation Group. And the Data Citation Group has been going, ever since the beginning, and it's recently published a big paper, what Andy has called the magnum opus of the working group. That really gives a broad overview of what the group has done and goes into great detail about a lot of the implementations. So, but Andy, maybe just to start things off, how did things get started? I mean, I was there, but I wasn't really actively involved. It was right there at that first plenary, right?
So at the first RDA meeting, we had the first informal sit together and discussing the creation of it. Yeah.
And so did you come to the plenary with this notion that you wanted to solve this problem of precisely identifying arbitrary subsets of dynamic data?
I definitely wouldn't have phrased it that way at that point in time. Because even that phrasing required some time to mature. But basically the idea of identifying data and for reproducibility purposes and so on. So it wasn't really much about citing the data, but for reproducibility purposes, being able to identify it in the first place. And once you identify it, you can cite it. So I guess that was the starting point.
And then as I recall, at the first plenary, we just had these sort of ad hoc breakouts. People broke out in, I'd probably put up your hand and said something about identification and reproducibility, and a bunch of people went into your room.
We went somewhere in a lounge corner.
Or a corner, right. Yeah, there were different clusters of people. I remember that. Did initial sort of seed of the charter form at that point?
That started pretty early, yeah. I guess what we had very soon was a rough idea of what potential solutions might be. So we narrowed it down to 2 or 3 ideas that then very quickly converged onto one approach that then everybody thought was not working and not doable. And that was actually the exciting part about it, because then everybody said, this doesn't work because, and that's exactly the way how you test an idea before even moving into the first pilots and prototypes and so on, and proof of concept things that came then later on, and long before anything deployable would be.
Well, but that's why I got very excited about the group early on, even though I wasn't directly involved, is that before RDA, I'd been working on data citation issue, and we hit this problem of, okay, we'd sort of seen it as, how do you cite the page in a book? But in this case, the book is constantly growing and is constantly changing. Except in this case, there is no page in the book, and there's no particular canonical version of the book that you can refer to. But we thought of things like sacred texts that use the structure of the work to refer to pieces of it, so book, chapter, verse, etc. And so often when querying data, it's similar. You're querying the structure of the data, like date and time, for example. So doing that with a carefully versioned data set, and you're most of the way there. And so I was very excited when your group sort of came up with the same sort of conceptual model, but then came up with a way to implement it. Because, the recommendation isn't really a specification. It's more of like, well, it's a set of recommendations. It's recommended practice. It's like if you do these 14 things, then it's not hard to cite a subset of dynamic data.
I guess for me, the surprising thing was that coming actually from a computer science background and working with databases, the solution was there before I was aware of the problem, basically. And for me, it was always clear that it would work that way because that's the way you work with data. Version databases have been around, queries have been around, re-executing queries has been around, and that can identify anything. And since the guys who are working in databases basically build databases for all kinds of data, that was an obvious candidate. So actually the surprising thing to me at the beginning was when we discussed the ideas, how many people actually opposed it and said, this doesn't work. But on the other hand, we've seen it working in so many different domains without people calling it that way or using it for that purpose.
Well, I think that's another maybe sort of highlight of the adventure is it brought computer scientists and data practitioners together. And in my experience, computer scientists will often say, oh, we solved that problem. And then you give them a real world problem and they're like, oh, yeah, the devil's in the details. And that's, I think, what a lot of the group did for several years is work through those details. First with the conceptual models, okay, it works with an SQL database. Okay, it works with files. Okay, it works with XML. And then I think more critically with the implementations where not only is it different data models and different data structures, it's experimental science versus observational science. It's whole different ways of conceiving the universe. But it kept working.
Including even fun sidetrack issues that I hadn't been expecting before, such as, when we said we would identify query with its execution timestamp, and somebody's suddenly worrying that would reveal the time you have been working on that problem, and whether some other timestamp could be used rather than the precise execution timestamp if you were working in the middle of the night when you were not supposed to be officially working. I said, okay, let's use the last update timestamp to the database, which must have been sometime earlier than that and not give such a precise indication of when you hit the run button. So those were kind of sidetrack issues, but that we would never have thought of unless, having such a wide community of people coming from different backgrounds, different work environments with different formal restrictions, informal restrictions. And it was actually quite fun to discover those. So that was actually quite cool and unexpected and solvable.
Right. So you all produced the recommendation, you basically countered everybody's examples of this won't work and came up with the 14 recommendations. What motivated you to really then work through adoption? I remember RDA was figuring out what do we do with groups that have delivered, and this was one of the first ones to deliver, a real tangible recommendation. Did the idea come from you, or was there pressure from RDA, or both?
There definitely wasn't any pressure. I wouldn't react to pressure, I guess. That wouldn't work. No, I think it was three things, actually. First of all, pushing it through to adoption is not that it's a tremendous amount of unpleasant work, because the little work that was needed actually was keeping running those meetings and discussing with people. And if there's one thing that we like doing, it's discussing our science, our results, our proposals, and seeing whether they actually work. So the work that was involved was not of enormous amount, and it was interesting work anyway. The second thing was that it was actually exciting to see that somebody was really interested in that. So that it's not just the recommendations you put out and then people say, yes, fine, we've read them, and yes, we support it, and it's a good idea. But when some people actually came back and said, we would like to try it out, can you help us? And so it was this both intrinsic motivation to see it being moved forward, as well as somebody actually being interested in the work that you've produced. which is also, a nice feedback for the time that you've invested actually before, because that was where the major time investment was in. And so I guess it was that combination. Plus we had, there were the grants coming along for the pilot adopters that helped them to implement it. And so I guess it created an environment where it just happened naturally.
So one of the things, when I was Secretary General, I would often use this working group as an example of, an effective working group. And I, personally had an interest in the recommendation, so it's something that I could, promote. But a lot of pushback, and I think we still get that pushback, is it's complicated, it's hard, it takes a lot of time. I don't have, you mentioned earlier, infrastructure people are wisely cautious at making changes in their infrastructure, but that's not the pushback I was getting. The pushback I was getting was, it's just too darn hard, it's going to take too much work. And my reaction was, well, but doing it is a good thing to do regardless. It's going to improve your data management, data stewardship processes overall. And I think we definitely saw that as a conclusion in the paper, because of the 8 different implementation pilots or case studies, whatever you want to call them, not all of them, maybe none of them implemented all 14 recommendations, 1 or 2 maybe. But every single one found some benefit by even implementing just a couple recommendations. They had happier users, they had clearer provenance, they had, better, more well-documented processes that they could repeat. But my impression is, and I'd be curious what your impression is, I don't think we've hit critical mass. I mean, people are still like, oh gosh, this is hard.
First of all, I'm actually quite happy that none of them had to implement all 14 recommendations, because the last 2 about technology change, changing the complete database data infrastructure, which luckily doesn't happen within the 1 or 2 years that recommendations are around. But basically, I guess we were lucky in one thing, is that the first real pilot deployment, actual deployment that happened, was Leslie's implementation of the infrastructure in the medical databases. And she could basically show, she very carefully kept track of the investment made in terms of person months that it took from planning the idea to implementing, testing, and deploying it. And she offset that towards the costs of doing it the conventional way. So having somebody request data for a reproduction study and having to go through the process manually. And I would need to look up the numbers again, but I guess it was somewhere the break even was between 3 and 4 reproduction studies. So getting the same data out manually to verify an earlier study that had been done, that happens 3 or 4 times, you've basically covered the costs that were necessary to implement the solution. Now, this might be a lucky hit, and they had an extremely well set up database infrastructure, so it might have been easier to implement than in some other settings. And so the real break even might differ from institution to institution. But in reality, there is a break even when you automate such things and when you improve the processes behind it. And it does improve the quality of science, because suddenly it also becomes cheaper to do a reproducibility study. So you can actually, more people will do it. So you will test science more continuously and more regularly.
Yeah.
It's those aspects that come into play as well. It is expensive, but it's not that expensive if you compare it to what if you don't do it.
Yeah. And I guess that's just, maybe it's still early days. And so that hasn't been fully, maybe it becomes more apparent, an institution or a field where a reproducibility study is required. So in the medical sciences, that's going to happen more often than, say, in the Earth observations. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting way of putting it, though, that ultimately it will save you money if we are going to actually do good reproducible science. Do you think that message has gotten out there?
The message, I guess, is out there. And also the aspect of reproducibility in science is definitely getting more prominence.
Yeah.
And not just in science. I mean, even in industry, this is of increasing importance. I mean, we've had a few industry partners who discuss it with, and they have exactly the same problem. If you go to a board meeting presenting charts and numbers, and then decisions are being made, as long as the decision holds, nobody double question them. But if the decision turns out to be wrong, then somebody has to be the culprit. Then you start looking for it. And even if not to fire somebody, but just to avoid the same problem happening a second time.
Right.
And so this whole reproducibility is getting more scrutiny. And we also see the same thing now, especially in Europe with the new AI regulations, where auditability, transparency in AI, explainability come into play. And that requires ultimately a certain degree of reproducibility.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think So I've been working with data for AI related issues as well. And maybe AI will drive this more than anything, because the black box is a little worrying. And if you don't have good data transparency, you can't really verify that the black box is doing the right thing.
So actually, since you mentioned AI, one of the recent problems that we've been contacted about and that we are currently discussing is online learning systems, because they are basically models that are evolving with every single data item that they're receiving as input. So they're continuously learning. That's exactly the same as an evolving data set. And if you want to find out at which point that system went awry, or why something happened, or what happened at a certain point in time 2 weeks ago, you don't have that model anymore because it's continuously updated, which is exactly the same thing as an evolving data source. We're actually now looking of applying the same technology for such problems that are not typical data versioning issues, but it's the same thing. It's data representing a model.
Yeah, it's the same with climate modeling or comparison. Yeah. So yeah, that's a really good point. So maybe that'll make this more of a norm. Maybe we shouldn't be calling it citation, like you said at the beginning. You know, it's precise identification. And this is another thing that, you know, I think we struggle with within the group, and that I think we struggle with citation writ large, is that so much is bundled into the term citation. And it's a very specific scholarly context. And like you were just saying with industry, they don't necessarily care about, you know, citing your findings. They just want to make sure that you got the data right and they can reproduce the work.
Actually, that was a lesson that we learned very early on through the existence of the working group, but a little bit too late to correct it, which was the naming was probably a bit unfortunate, because citation, the term citation in the name of the working group created expectations on things that we would address that were not in the core focus of the working group at all. So in retrospect, calling it precise identification of dynamic data, of evolving data, would probably have been more precise and caused less confusion in the early days of the discussion. I guess that was a critical point, because I guess we were extremely lucky in our timing, because by the time when we had our recommendations out, we were faced with one challenge, which was that adoption in our case did not mean signing a paper and agreeing to it, because that would have been utterly useless, because adoption meant implementing it and deploying it. But we were lucky that exactly at that time, some of the adoption grants came about that RDA was making available. And they were, first of all, relatively low effort to apply for. And they were sufficient to convince a few of the infrastructures that were already participating in the discussion and who were already familiar with the principles, the ideas, and the mindset to take one step further and say, okay, we are volunteering to be kind of early adopter. We are taking the risk because some of the risk is offset by this adoption grants. They never fully funded an adoption, but they kind of contributed sufficient. They would say, okay, that's a risk we're willing to take. We have been involved in discussion before. We know what we are embarking on. And that's when they set off and implementing the first 1, 2, 3 pilots, basically, that came from such grants. And then others actually put it into the next project proposals that they were handing in for putting it into the next revamp of the infrastructure altogether. And I guess the largest deployment was the last one that we had on Ocean Networks Canada, who launched a massive project to do not just the data citation stuff, but to really rebuild basically the data infrastructure, as far as I understand it. And then this was, an additional add-on.
Ocean Networks Canada didn't get an adoption.
Sorry?
Ocean Networks Canada did not get a
No, that was way later. So that was the last one that we had. And they basically saw it, they observed it. And I don't know what motivated them. That's something that we need to discuss with them. But basically, they found this, since they were setting off to re-implement their infrastructure, they would add that functionality, the data citation functionality, from scratch to it.
Right. Well, I talked a little bit to Raymond Jenkins, who led that effort. And I think part of it was that recognition of what we were talking about earlier, that this is actually just good stewardship, careful versioning, being able to repeat queries, understanding technical migration, that's just good stewardship practice. And so since she had this charge to rethink their whole infrastructure, this fit in kind of nicely. And your point about adoption grants, I think the big takeaway there for RDA, I think writ large, is a little bit of seed money can go a long way. So I had left RDA and was working for the Deep Carbon Observatory and got a small adoption grant. I didn't actually get the grant, but I was a little bit involved in the project. And it was small, like you say. It was, basically it paid for an undergraduate student for the summer and maybe a little bit of grad student time. And that didn't cover the full cost, but that was enough to keep it moving. The real cost was in policy decisions and things like that you have to make within your infrastructure, not the implementing of versioning. The undergrad was great for implementing the versioning scheme, but the policy decisions about technical migration, encouraging citation, all those sorts of things, that wasn't really a funding issue. That was, a motivation issue. But, $10,000 can sometimes provide that motivation because you then have to make these policy decisions because now you have careful versioning, whatever it might be. So I hope, and it looks like the European Commission is continuing that, but I would hope, and you see little bits and pieces of that, but I mean, just a little bit of money can go a long way. You don't have to fund the whole thing. The working group wasn't funded, but it had a little bit of support. And then these adoptions weren't fully funded, but they had a little bit of support. And then got to the point where, like you say, with Ocean Networks Canada, major undertaking, funded completely independently of RDA, had nothing to do with RDA per se, but learned from the experience of RDA and as a best practice sort of.
Were there people in that project that were part of the working group initially?
Not initially. I mean, they joined later on and I don't know why and where they heard of it, but yeah, they joined some of the meetings, where the other adoption stories were being presented, because that's what we basically did after the working group officially finished. At each meeting, we were just having different presentations from different groups that were presenting what they had done, the problems that they had encountered, in most cases, how they tried to solve them. And then we would discussing upcoming issues of groups that were about to implement it and wanted to have discussed, how to best approach a certain sub-problem there. Mm-hmm. And it's during those phases actually that a lot of new participants joined, because the working group was reasonably sized at the beginning when we were still, starting with the ideas. There were a lot of people interested at the very beginning because of the citation term. Then we saw some people drop out once they found out that we were not really worried too much about the entries in the bibliography section and how to format them and how to spell them out. So then there was a kind of a core team working, but once we had the recommendations out and the first adoption stories coming in, that's when a lot of people suddenly started to join. Also, I guess we then did a number of webinars where each, pilot was being presented, and even they attracted a lot of additional audience and participants, not necessarily during the actual live broadcast of the webinar, but we were tracking a little bit about how many people were actually watching them afterwards. Right. And then, I didn't track of who was watching and then signed up, but there was a lot of people signing up continuously in that time when we launched these first webinars about it and the success stories, basically.
So that brings me to a question, Andy. What drove the group to want to write this big paper? Because it wasn't a trivial exercise.
It definitely wasn't. It was not the actual writing that was the problem. No, basically, we always had the idea we would like to bring those experiences and those stories together. And I don't know for how many RDA meetings I had promised I would start putting the first draft together and produce a skeleton that then people can fill in, because the empty page syndrome is the one that's killing most of the actual successful output. So I had promised it for a long time, and then some circumstances got me to actually start the first draft. Then we had the first draft compiled, and that was lying around for quite a long time until actually Umar pushed me again and said, what about the skeleton that we have there? And yeah, then I guess it was still quite a lot of effort of getting it somewhat consistent, because there were contributions from so many different authors, all coming from a different background with very different writing styles.
Well, I think that's actually one of the remarkable things about the paper is, going back to this magnum opus concept, is that every one of the authors, or certainly the vast majority of the authors, actually wrote. They didn't just provide ideas and editing, they wrote whole sections. That's unusual with a 15-author paper or however many authors it is.
Leading us ultimately to the problem that it really was an opus magnum, a really large piece of work that was even hard to find a place where to actually put it in that would accept, a venue that would accept such a massive body of work being nicely laid out ultimately.
Yeah.
So if there are any kind of advice you could give for some of these groups that are just getting started?
I guess the key measures: focus and limit the scope. So the key mantra at the beginning in the early days of RDA was picking the low-hanging fruits. I mean, later on you realized that the tree is actually larger than you thought and the low-hanging fruits are still pretty high. But limiting the scope to a relatively simple, or at least well delineated problem, I guess what helped us, because we had a lot of additional ideas in the first 2 or 3 meetings that people wanted to have also addressed as part of the working group. And I guess a few people felt maybe a bit offended when we said, yes, it's an interesting problem, but not here. And I guess and definitely a few people left the working group because that problem was not incorporated into the bigger picture that we were addressing. And I think this was both, bad for those ideas that were also valid and credible ideas. But I think having small and focused ideas and rather a somewhat larger number of working groups that focus on specific ideas, that was one of the key success criteria for us.
So, but when you started, nominally a RDA working group is supposed to deliver in 18 months, and I think you did roughly, but you weren't expecting to be working on this for 8 years when you first started, did you?
No, but we also didn't deliver in 18 months. I mean, we officially delivered in 18 months because we were officially approved way later in the process. So I guess we had the first 3 meetings before we actually, or 4 meetings even, before we submitted the application document.
Charter, right.
Then it took another 2 meetings probably before we finally got it approved. It wasn't because the approval process was so long and complicated. It was just that we weren't really worried about the approval because we kept discussing anyway, and RDA was still willing to host us at plenaries, give us the room to discuss, in spite of us not being officially adopted yet. And so once we actually had the working group up and running, we were already well in the process of the discussion. We basically had a pretty good idea. We had sorted out all the issues of what to discuss and what not to discuss. And so I guess realistically, if it really would have been a harsh, you're not allowed to start discussing until you've been approved, you have to deliver 18 months later, forget it. We would have failed.
Oh, no.
And the process does take longer.
Yeah, and RDA learned that lesson. I mean, you were part of the time when RDA was figuring out what it meant to bless a working group, what it meant to approve an output, and they were still figuring that out. And interest groups weren't even initially conceived of, and so that's where interest groups came, and that helped, I think, foster that pre-conversation that helps you focus. The notion of birds of a feather, I think it's a pretty common model now. You have a birds of a feather to see if you can refine a problem and define a specific problem, and then you spin up a work. Because I think you're absolutely right. Getting that focus is so important. I think that's true of any standardization exercise. You really have to make it as narrow as you possibly can, which is in some ways kind of boring, but it also makes it achievable.
Yeah, and having that flexibility within RDA, I guess, was another key issue because it offered us a lot of outreach opportunities because it attracted a lot of attention. So we got a lot of different people in the rooms initially. Many of them stayed, some left, new people came in. But the setting, this interdisciplinary setting, having infrastructures from all kinds of domains actually was helpful as well, because that ensured that we were not discussing one specific type of data running on one specific type of database, but that we really were confronted with the wide variety of settings being discussed. And it also helped us in the opposite direction, because once we had those recommendations, we could say, this has been discussed by this large community. And once you can say that a large community agrees on something of being in principle viable, and then you have a few even isolated early adopters, that actually helps or improve the impact of the recommendations as such. So it helped us in both directions. It got us the right people. And once we had the right people, it strengthened the output and also the credibility of the output.
So what's next? We didn't have a meeting at the last RDA, which is, I think, maybe the first plenary that the working group didn't meet. Are we done? I mean, there's always more adoption. There's more. I mean, I think the paper demonstrated that it works, and there's always more adoption that can be done. Is that? And we can keep ticking along on that, but I don't know. Are we losing momentum?
No. So actually, I mean, the reason why I decided not to actually push heavily for a meeting at the last plenaries was that I'm not convinced that for the type of discussion that we are currently having, for the kind of informal exchange between adopters and potential adopters and newly interested people, that the online venue is a particularly good setting for that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, even at the plenaries, there is a lot of presentation, but then at least the discussion happens at the coffee breaks. Online venues are not very suitable to that. So the really nitty-gritty details, the dangerous questions, nobody dares to really ask or answer in a video stream. The mistakes that you've made, what went wrong, where were you most frustrated, all that stuff, that happens over coffee or other drinks. And I guess that's also part of the success that we had quite a lot of those discussions going on. And I guess here we might even have a new topic to discuss as part of the working group, which is this whole drift into fairness now, which is machine actionability that we always had on the agenda from the very first moments of our discussion on, which is allowing machines to identify the data, reproducible link, a link to a reproducible set of data. Term fairness wasn't really that widespread in those days when we started off the working group, so it's not really reflected in the recommendation. But the machine actionability is, and so I think that might be actually one of the new topics to discuss and rephrase or reevaluate some of the recommendations from that perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So here's the message to new chairs: beware. You're in, there is no way out.
Thank you so much, Andy and Mark, for sharing with us today. We certainly do recognize and thank you both for the enormous contributions and commitment you've given to this community. Thanks to the listeners for joining our first podcast, and please visit the RDA website at rd-alliance.org to join the community. Thank you for listening.
The Data Streams podcast series is hosted by the Research Data Alliance U.S. region and funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. Upbeat theme loop, created by Mirth Nerona, is used under a Creative Commons license. For more information about the group or outputs discussed on today's podcast, or to listen to other episodes, find us at rd-alliance.org/podcast or on the Research Data Alliance's YouTube channel. Thanks for listening.